Welcome to the deep dive. And before we even get started today, I just really want to offer a warm welcome to you, the listener, and say may God bless your day and your entire week. We are so glad you're choosing to spend this time with us.
Yeah, it truly is a privilege to be here. I mean, I'm thrilled to jump into today's material with you.
Because our mission today is, well, it's a uniquely fascinating one. We're looking at a text you've probably heard a dozen times in passing, or maybe you haven't encountered it at all. But our goal isn't just to read a simple story and move on.
Right, we want to really dig in.
Exactly. We're drawing from notes and excerpts found in two incredibly rigorous historical and linguistic commentaries. So that's the Holman Study Bible and the NAA Study Bible.
And for those who might not know, NAA stands for Nova Almeida Actualizada, which is just a highly regarded translation and study resource.
It's excellent. We are focusing specifically on the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verse 1 through chapter 13, verse 4. And we want to uncover the historical, linguistic, and cultural layers hiding right beneath the surface of this really famous narrative.
Which is the real value of taking a deep dive like this. We aren't merely skimming for plot points. We're zooming in on the ancient context to understand how the original audience would have actually heard these words.
And the juxtaposition in this specific chunk of text is just wild. It opens with one of the most foundational, beautiful promises in all of human history. Then, almost immediately,
Like literally the next paragraph.
yes, it pivots sharply into this messy, highly questionable family drama involving a 65-year-old beauty, a pharaoh, a devastating plague, and a fairly elaborate lie.
It's quite the roller coaster. To properly understand it, though, we need to completely pull ourselves out of the modern world. We have to place ourselves firmly in the ancient Near East.
Leave the modern baggage at the door.
Totally. That means leaving behind our modern safety nets, our concepts of nation-states, and even our modern ethical frameworks. We have to be prepared to look at this familiar story of Abram with completely fresh, analytical eyes.
So let's set the stage with that initial radical departure. We open Genesis 12 with God telling Abram to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's house. To a modern ear, that sounds somewhat like, hey, pack up and move to a new city for a better job.
Right, like an exciting career move.
But in the ancient world, removing those specific things was a much heavier proposition, wasn't it?
Oh, incredibly heavier. The NAA Study Bible notes emphasize how Abram is essentially being challenged to abandon his only sources of personal identity and survival.
Because you didn't have police or social security.
Exactly. In the ancient Near East, your land was your economic livelihood. Your relatives were your physical protection, your police force and military, so to speak, and your father's house represented your social standing, your inheritance, and your safety net.
So leaving all three
Meant abandoning every single pillar of ancient security. Without them, you were completely vulnerable to famine, bandits, and foreign kings. It was a call to absolute, unconditional trust, effectively removing all human support.
And we really cannot gloss over the physical reality of what that demand looked like on the ground.
Yeah.
Relying on the Holman notes, we see that Abram wasn't exactly a spry young backpacker setting out on some gap year adventure.
Not at all.
He was 75 years old when he left the region of Haran, which is up near the modern-day border of Turkey and Syria. And the journey from Haran down into Canaan, it was a grueling trek of approximately 724 kilometers.
724 kilometers, traveling by foot and caravan.
I mean, imagine being 75 and setting out across that kind of distance. You're dealing with a harsh climate, rugged terrain, the constant threat of raiders, and you're moving into entirely unknown territory. It paints a very vivid picture of what obedience actually cost him.
It does. And it also frames the profound scale of the promise he was given in exchange. God's discourse here defines the agenda not just for Abram's immediate family, but for all families of the earth.
That's massive.
He's promised that he will become a great nation, that his name will be great, and that he will be a conduit of blessing to the entire world.
I really want to dig into the specific language of that promise, because there's a brilliant word study in the Holman notes about the Hebrew vocabulary used here.
Yeah, the central word in that linguistic study is zera.
Zera.
Right. It translates literally to seed or descendant. The Holman notes point out that this specific word appears 59 times in the book of Genesis alone.
59 times.
Yeah, it's a major theme. It can refer to literal agricultural seed that you plant in the ground, but in this context, it indicates human offspring lineage or race.
Which feels like a staggering, almost mocking promise to make to an elderly, childless couple. Abram is 75. His wife Sarai is also advanced in age, and the text is very clear that she's historically barren.
Right.
Yet this grand vision of becoming a great nation hinges entirely on this Zerah, this physical descendant.
It injects an immediate, palpable tension into the narrative. You have to wonder, how can a barren couple in their twilight years become a great nation? But, looking at the structural layout of Genesis, as the NAA notes suggest, this blessing serves a critical architectural purpose.
How so?
It reverses the negative trajectory of humanity that dominates all the preceding chapters.
Oh, are you referring to events like the Tower of Babel?
Precisely. Think about Babel. Humanity attempted to make a great name for themselves through their own engineering and collective self-aggrandizement. They tried to build their way up to the divine.
And it ended in a curse of confusion and geographic scattering.
Exactly. But here, the dynamic flips entirely. God reaches down to one seemingly insignificant, childless man and declares, "I will make your name great, and through you, the world will be blessed." The blessing agenda officially replaces the cursed trajectory. It is a profound literary foil.
Wow. So Abram accepts this premise. He makes the 724-kilometer trek, and he arrives in Canaan. But he doesn't stake his claim by building a fortress or a walled city. The text says he passes through to the site of Shechem at the Oak of Morah and builds an altar. Then he moves further south to the hill country between Bethel and Ai and builds another altar. I notice both our sources highlight these altars. What does that say about his strategy in a land already occupied by the Canaanites?
It speaks volumes about the era we call the patriarchal period. The Holman and NAA notes emphasize that this is a time long before the physical temple in Jerusalem existed, before the formal priesthood, and before the Mosaic law.
So no organized religious structures yet?
None. The family heads, or patriarchs, functioned as the spiritual leaders. By building these altars, Abram is creating patriarchal markers of worship. He doesn't have an army to conquer the Canaanites. Instead, his strategy is theological.
He's claiming it spiritually.
Yes, he's staking a spiritual claim on the land based entirely on the divine promise rather than a military conquest. He is publicly calling on the name of the Lord in a territory completely dominated by other gods.
It's a really striking visual of faith. You arrive in the promised land, you build your altars, and you expect the blessings to start flowing. But right as he settles in, reality hits hard. A severe famine strikes Canaan.
Which brings up a vital point about the geography and climate of the ancient Near East.
Let's see the end of that.
The NAA notes explain that Canaan functioned as a land bridge, and its agriculture depended heavily on seasonal rain. When the rains failed to materialize, you had immediate, devastating famine. Egypt, positioned to the south, was entirely different.
Because of the Nile.
Exactly. It relied on the annual flooding of the Nile River. Because of the Nile, Egypt served as the ancient breadbasket. It often had grain, even when all the surrounding regions were starving. So migrating south to Egypt during a famine wasn't necessarily a lack of faith in the moment. It was a standard, pragmatic survival tactic for ancient nomads.
Pragmatic on the surface, sure. But the journey south leads to one of the most famously uncomfortable moments in Abram's life. As they are about to cross the border into Egypt, Abram just panics. He realizes his wife, Sarai, is incredibly beautiful. He fears the Egyptians will assassinate him just to take her into their harem, so he concocts a strategy.
A very problematic strategy.
Yes. He tells her, "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake and my life will be spared."
It's a startling moment of self-preservation. It seems to completely contradict the profound trust he demonstrated just chapters earlier by leaving Haran.
And I have to bring up a detail that always trips modern readers up. According to the timeline in the Holman notes, Sarai is at least 65 years old at this time.
Right.
I hear the ancient diet theories, but she's 65. That still seems like a stretch to make a pharaoh swoon to the point of murder. Is there more to it than just good genetics?
It's definitely a detail that catches the modern reader off guard. The Holman notes offer some helpful historical context to bridge that gap. They suggest her remarkable beauty at that age could be attributed to a combination of factors. First, a wealthy, aristocratic lifestyle provided a superior diet and way less physical labor compared to the average ancient peasant.
Okay, that makes sense. Less sun exposure, better food.
Exactly. Second, we have to factor in the era's longer lifespans. If you look at the genealogies of the patriarchal period, people were living significantly longer. Abram himself lived to be 175.
Wow.
So at 65, Sarai was essentially middle-aged and might have physically appeared much younger by our current standards.
Even accepting that historical premise, the scheme itself is highly problematic. It's a half-truth, as we find out later in Genesis, that she actually is his half-sister. They share a father, but not a mother. But it is undeniably a strategic lie of omission.
Yes, it is.
He's hiding the fact that she is his wife to save his own skin, essentially offering her up to a foreign king.
And what really stands out here is how the ancient narrator handles this morally ambiguous action. The NAA study notes point out a crucial literary feature of ancient biblical narratives.
Which is?
The narrator often refuses to provide a direct moral evaluation of the character's actions. The text doesn't pause the story to insert a commentary saying, "And Abram sinned greatly by doing this."
It just reports the events sequentially and leaves the tension hanging.
Yes, it forces you, the listener, to evaluate the ethics of this deeply flawed protagonist entirely on your own. It creates a deliberate sense of discomfort. I mean, Abram is the hero of the faith, the sole recipient of the grand promise, but he's also capable of this incredibly selfish, fear-driven stratagem.
Which is remarkably honest for an ancient text. Usually, foundational national heroes are painted as these flawless demigods who never make a wrong move. Here, the patriarch of the nation is kind of a mess.
A huge mess.
And the worst part is, the scheme actually works. Pharaoh's officials see Sarai, they praise her to Pharaoh, she is taken into his house, and Abram's life is spared. In fact, he gets rewarded with an enormous dowry.
The text provides a very specific inventory of the wealth Pharaoh gives Abram. It lists sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels.
Wait, camels? I thought I read somewhere in archaeological summaries that camels weren't domesticated until much later in history. Isn't their inclusion here considered an anachronism by some historians?
That is a very perceptive catch, and it's a major point of discussion in biblical archaeology. Many scholars have indeed argued that the mention of camels in the patriarchal narratives is an anachronism, a mistake inserted by a later editor.
Right, because of the timeline.
Yeah, the prevailing theory for a long time was that camels were not widely domesticated for use until around 1100 BC, which is centuries after Abram's time.
So how do the commentaries reconcile that?
Well, the NAA notes counter the anachronism argument by pointing to more recent archaeological discoveries. There are bone fragments and artistic depictions suggesting limited use of domesticated camels by human beings as early as 3000 BC.
Long before Abram.
Exactly. The evidence indicates they weren't used for widespread everyday farming. Instead, they were utilized occasionally for grueling, long-distance desert travel.
So if they were rare, what does Abram possessing them signify?
It signifies that Abram wasn't just a standard herder. Possessing camels in that specific era indicated extreme, almost exorbitant wealth.
They were the luxury vehicles of the ancient world.
Perfect comparison. They were a luxury item. Mentioning them emphasizes just how elite Abram's newly acquired status was, and just how high a price Pharaoh was willing to pay for Sarai. Abram walked into Egypt as a starving nomad fleeing a famine, and thanks to his deception, he became staggeringly rich.
But the emotional tension is agonizing. He had the luxury camels, the servants, and the silver, but he lost his wife. He lost the very woman through whom that 59 times repeated word, Zerah, the descendant, is supposed to come.
He really did.
He has painted himself into a corner where human ingenuity cannot save him, so the divine has to intervene.
And the text simply states that the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with severe plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife.
God has to forcefully rescue the promise because Abram completely fumbled it. And I find it fascinating that Pharaoh's reaction is the one grounded in righteousness. He figures out what's going on, perhaps through divination and investigation by his priests, or just connecting the arrival of this new woman with the sudden outbreak of plagues.
However he finds out, he is not happy.
He summons Abram and delivers a stinging rebuke.
Pharaoh demands, "What is this you have done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is your sister?" It's a powerful role reversal.
It really is. The pagan king is lecturing the chosen patriarch on ethics.
Right. Pharaoh points out that he could have unwittingly committed a grave moral offense by consummating a relationship with another man's wife.
So Pharaoh expels him, he gives strict orders to his men, and they deport Abram, along with his wife and everything he'd acquired. He gets to keep the wealth, but he is escorted out of the country in disgrace.
Now, looking at the structural notes in both the Holman and NAA sources, This sequence of events reveals a literary parallel that is almost too mathematically precise to be an accident.
Oh, this is fascinating.
This entire, somewhat embarrassing detour into Egypt functions as a vivid, deliberate foreshadowing of the future Israelite exodus.
Let's slow down and trace those parallels, because this is one of the most profound insights in the notes.
Sure.
It completely changes how you read the story.
It absolutely does. Let's walk through the sequence step by step. First, a severe, life-threatening famine forces God's chosen people, in this specific instance, Abram, to migrate south out of the Promised Land and down into Egypt for survival.
Which mirrors exactly what happens centuries later when a severe famine forces Abram's great-grandson Joseph and the entire extended family of Israel down into Egypt.
Correct. That's the first parallel. The second parallel, a pharaoh gets involved and effectively takes the people captive, claiming ownership over them. For Abram, it's Sarai being taken into the royal harem. Later, it will be the entire nation of Israel forced into brutal state slavery.
And then the mechanism of rescue is identical.
Yes, God doesn't use a military coalition to save them. He rescues his people by sending severe plagues directly upon Pharaoh's house.
And the vocabulary there is intentional, right?
Very. The Hebrew text explicitly uses the word plagues here in Genesis, prefiguring the 10 devastating plagues God will unleash in the days of Moses to break the Egyptian bondage. And the final, undeniable parallel is the exit. The people leave Egypt, not empty-handed or destitute, but carrying immense wealth provided by the Egyptians themselves.
Abram leaves with sheep, oxen, servants, and those luxury camels. Centuries later, the Israelites will leave Egypt after effectively plundering the Egyptians, taking silver, gold, and clothing. The blueprint is identical. But why would the ancient narrator construct the text this way? What is the purpose of this mirroring?
We have to think about the original audience. The ancient readers of this text were the Israelites living after the Exodus, perhaps wandering in the wilderness or recently settled in Canaan.
So they would have known the Moses story intimately.
Exactly. When they heard this story of Abram, they would instantly recognize their own harrowing national history embedded right there in their ancestors' life. It served as a profound theological anchor,
Showing that God is consistent.
proving to them that God's plans and his specific methods of rescue remain consistent across generations. Even when the human actors fail entirely or resort to cowardly deception, God's overarching promise and his ability to deliver remain unconditionally intact.
That brings us to the aftermath of the expulsion. Abram has been deported. He travels back up from Egypt into the Negev, which is the arid, southern desert region of Canaan. But he doesn't just wander aimlessly. Genesis 13 tells us he makes his journeys from the Negev all the way back north to Bethel.
Returning to the very place where his tent had been at the beginning.
Right, between Bethel and Egeh. He goes back to the exact spot where he had built his first altar.
And the Holman notes provide a deeply resonant interpretation of this geographic movement. They suggest this is much more than just a nomad returning to a familiar, safe campsite.
It reads like a spiritual reset.
That is the perfect term for it, a spiritual reset. Abram had just experienced a monumental failure of faith in Egypt. Faced with a crisis, he had prioritized pragmatic survival and fear over trusting the divine promise that initially called him out of Haran.
But he goes back.
By returning to the altar, he is engaging in a deliberate rededication of his life to God. The text notes he invokes the name of the Lord there once again. It signifies a humble return to the posture of worship and dependence that he held when he first arrived in the land.
And I think that offers a deeply comforting takeaway for you, the listener, today. When we synthesize all the historical and literary notes from these sources, the story of Abram proves something vital about human nature.
It really does.
Being the recipient of a grand vision or having a distinct, divinely appointed purpose in your life does not immunize you from fear. It doesn't stop you from making mistakes or from resorting to messy, ethically questionable choices when the pressure is on.
Because progress is rarely a straight line. We tend to imagine that historical heroes of faith just moved seamlessly from one triumph to the next. But the biblical text refuses to hide Abram's flaws.
It puts them on full display.
It highlights his cowardice and his deception, perhaps to show us that the ultimate fulfillment of any great promise relies far more on the faithfulness of the promise maker than the perfection of the promise receiver.
Abram panicked at the very first sign of a literal famine, and it created a cascade of compromises that nearly cost him everything. But the journey back to the altar between Bethel and Ai shows that failure isn't final. You can always retrace your steps and return to the place of initial trust.
A profound reminder that restoration is always available.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to chew on this week. We've spent this time dissecting Abram's reaction to crisis. But turn that lens inward. Think about your own life, your own goals, or the long-term vision you hold for your future.
Bringing it home.
When we are given a massive promise or set a grand goal, how often do we panic at the very first sign of our own personal famine? When the resources dry up or the path gets difficult, how quickly do we abandon our core principles?
That's the real test, isn't it?
Exactly. Do we immediately try to engineer our own flawed, deceptive solutions rather than trusting the original vision that set us on the path to begin with? It's a psychological trap as old as humanity, and it's something worth exploring in your own journey this week.
A deeply challenging question to sit with, and one that resonates just as strongly today as it did in the ancient Near East.
It definitely does. Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive into the foundational narratives of Genesis. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the ancient world. May God bless all listeners.